fly in August. It's the South, so it's supposed to be hot, right? But when it starts breaking records, and we had records broken in Dallas and in East Texas, I think you had some, I know you had some very hot temperatures because I was up here during some of it. You were trying to rival us, but we were, way up over 100 degrees day after day after day. And as you go through days like that, it just seems hard to imagine the time is actually going to come when it's going to be cool in the mornings, and feast time is going to come here. The month of September opened, and we were having record-breaking heat up around 107, 108 there in Kilgore, 1st of September, and Thursday morning before we left to come up to Arkansas, my wife and I took a walk, and we got out early that morning and actually needed a sweater on. Felt good, and that's feast is in the air. And as the weather begins to change, and of course that's just the way it should be. It's like, people we get to thinking about the feast in just a matter of 2 weeks from last night. We will have the opening service of the Feast of Tabernacles and the various locations wherever you may be. And as you come out of that evening service, if the sky is not clouded over, you'll be able to look up and you'll see a big, bright, full moon. And we are at that festival season. It's certainly appropriate that we should focus in the festival seasons on things that specifically are relevant to God's plan and purpose as revealed in the festivals. God emphasizes that there are 3 seasons in the year, 3 times in the year when we appear before Him. The early spring season of Passover and unleavened bread, the late spring season of Pentecost, and the fall festival season, the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Ingathering, as it was also called, because it was at the end of the summer, beginning of the fall. It was right prior to this time, right around this time, that the crops that had been being harvested were gathered out of the fields and into the barns, because right after the fall Feast of Tabernacles was normally when the rainy season began in ancient Israel. So they called it the Feast of Ingathering. They were gathering in the crops and preparing to go up to Jerusalem and to celebrate this festival. And these festival seasons highlight the very plan and purpose that God is working out. The harvest seasons in ancient Israel were a type of the spiritual harvest in which God is engaged. And they depict the various aspects of the plan of salvation. Most people think that salvation is sort of a one-time thing, or if you grew up in the Baptist church, as I did years ago, you heard the phrase, once saved, always saved. Well, that's true if you understand what salvation really is, when it's completed, and when you are truly saved. Because there are really 3 phases to the process of salvation, typed by each of the 3 festival seasons. The first phase of salvation is justification. You're justified, made innocent, brought into harmony with God. Sinners are reconciled to God. The season of redemption and deliverance, that's what's symbolized and pictured in the early spring festival period, Passover and unleavened bread. First, we must be justified, made innocent, and brought into harmony with God. Secondly, the second phase of salvation is we must be sanctified, made holy. Feast of Pentecost pictures the pouring out of the Spirit of God, because it is through the indwelling of God's Spirit that we are sanctified, set apart, made holy. God's laws are written in our hearts and in our minds. The whole period of this time in which we're living, the time of what the Bible calls the first fruits harvest. God's character is being produced in us through His Holy Spirit working in our lives, and the trials and the tests and the things that we go through. The trials and the tests serve to set that character. If you've ever been involved with sculpture, sometimes when we're moving chairs and tables, you look back there and they have evidently classes that come in and do sculpture work. And if you've ever been involved with that, you know that you take the clay and you moisten it with water, and you make it pliable until the point that you can work with it, and you work with it and you shape it and you make it into whatever it is. Most of us, if we were making something, it probably wouldn't look like too much. I hate to think, what kind of blob I would turn out. I think I made something, 40-some-odd years ago in Vacation Bible School. My mother may still have it around somewhere. It didn't look like much then, and it sure doesn't look like much now, But somebody who knows what he's doing, it is an impressive thing to watch a potter at work who really has skills. It's just amazing, as the wheel whirls around and he takes his hands and he shapes and it's like he just sort of moves them a little bit, and all of a sudden you see this vase or this article that is being produced. And it's there, and it's nice and it's pretty if it's done by a skillful potter. But it's soft. It's not something you can use. What has to happen? It has to go through, it has to be dried, it has to be fired. And it is through that fire that it is set. And it loses that elasticity. If you take a ceramic vase or something and you smash it on the floor, and maybe you take a hammer and you pound it to powder, you couldn't take that powder, add a little water, and turn around and make something else out of it, could you? There is something that took place in the firing of that article, the firing of that vessel. There is something that took place that produced a change. And that clay, which was so pliable and able to be molded and shaped and fashioned, that clay lost forever the quality of elasticity. It was set, and no longer can it be made into another vessel. We go through the trials and the tests of the Christian life, which God compares to fiery trials, to set and to harden that character that God's Spirit is producing in us. The second of the three festival seasons pictures the second phase of salvation. God is sanctifying, making us a holy people unto our God through the power of the Holy Spirit. The third and final phase of salvation is the one that we're celebrating in this fall festival season. First, we must be justified, then we must be sanctified. Finally, we will be glorified. We will be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. This flesh will put on immortality. Death will be swallowed up in victory. We will break forth in shining glory. Glorified sons of God. He that endures to the end, Jesus said, shall be saved. We have been justified by His blood, and we shall be saved by His life, Paul tells us in Romans chapter 5. Salvation is completed at the resurrection, when this mortal has put on immortality. When we are glorified, born of the Spirit. And so we anticipate the fulfillment, the completion of the process of salvation that God has begun in your life and in mine, and the fact that God ultimately is going to deal with all human beings. All men and women who have ever lived. Ultimately, the dead, small and great, are going to stand before God. And the books of the Bible are going to be opened up to their understanding. And the book of life is going to be opened back up, as John explains in Revelation 20. And then they will be judged by the things written in the books. The biblos, that's the term in the original. Same word we get our word Bible from. They'll be judged by the things written in the books, the same standard by which you and I are judged. Judgment must always be based upon a standard. I don't care what kind of judging you're doing, you have a standard that is the basis of that judgment. God's Word is the basis of His judgment. So we are here today on the Feast of Trumpets, the festival that inaugurates the 7th month in God's sacred calendar. And there is significance to that. Have you ever thought about the way God builds sevens into His holy days? To begin with, Leviticus 23 shows that there are 7 holy convocations that occur during the year. They fall during these 3 festival seasons. The first of the festivals, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, lasts for 7 days. You then count 7 weeks, beginning on the morrow after the Sabbath, during the days of unleavened bread, the day of the wave sheaf. You count 7 weeks to arrive at Pentecost. Then you come forward to the 7th month. And you come to the time, the grouping of the fall festivals. Feast of Trumpets on the first day, the Day of Atonement on the 10th day. Then the Feast of Tabernacles, which lasts for 7 days, followed by that final day, that 8th day, that last great day. So God has built in and designed a pattern into His Word. into His plan and purpose. We want to focus here in the concluding portion of the Feast of Trumpets on things relating very directly to this fall festival season and to its meaning. I think that a good place to begin is back in Acts chapter 17. The Apostle Paul, if you remember the story, had to flee from one city to the next. He had been in Thessalonica, had spent 3 Sabbaths there reasoning out of the Scriptures, as is brought out in Acts 17:2. And we find that there were those Jews who did not believe what he had to say, and they were moved with envy. Acts 17:5. And they stirred up, a few troublemakers, certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, is the description. That's usually the crowd that gets stirred up. And they set the whole city in an uproar. And Paul ultimately had to flee, had to get out of Thessalonica. And Paul and Silas left by night, and they came to a small little town by the name of Berea. And they went in there, and the people in Berea had a little different attitude. They listened to what Paul had to say, and we're told in Acts 17:11, they searched the Scriptures daily whether those things were so. And many of them believed. And also honorable women, which were Greeks, and of men, not a few. So many of the Jews in Berea believed, and a sizable number of the Greek population, men and women, believed what Paul had to say because they had an attitude of searching the Scriptures daily whether those things were so. Now, after Paul had preached there for a little while, he left, and we're told he was brought on to Athens in verse 15. And Silas and Timothy were going to come to him, and Paul waited for them in Athens. Now, Athens was a major city. Athens was the center of education and culture in the Roman Empire. It was the city from which the teachers and the professors came. Even the great teachers in Rome had gotten their training in Athens. Athens was the location of the academy founded by Plato. It was a center of learning. It was a center of education. It was a major city, the major city in Greece. And of course, Thessalonica and Berea were also in Greece, but much smaller cities, particularly Berea. Have you ever noticed in reading the New Testament that you don't read about any big church in Athens? You ever thought about that? There's no mention of a church in Athens. If one ever existed, it was very small. In fact, we'll notice that in Berea, just a small little village, we're told many of the Jews believed, and not a few of the Greeks. Now notice, when Paul is here in Athens, we find that he went up to Mars Hill. Mars Hill, also called, actually the term in Greek is Areopagus. That's the Greek term that means Mars Hill. Mars was, of course, one of the Greek gods. This was a hill dedicated to him. And one of the things that took place on Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, there was this location where people loved to gather. And when they were there, they loved nothing better than to hear or tell some new thing. Oh, that was the internet of the day. I mean, they couldn't tune in on the internet, but they could go to Mars Hill. And there was always somebody up there who had some unusual view. And Paul, when he came to town, and certain of the philosophers of the Epicureans and the Stoics encountered him, and they said, "What's this babbler going to say?" Others said, "Well, he seems to be talking about strange gods. He's got all these odd ideas about some other gods," because he talked about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him, we're told in verse 19, and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "We want to know what you're talking about. You bring strange things to our ears. We want to know what these things mean." For all the Athenians and the strangers that were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. Oh, they liked to get up there and to debate and to discuss and to listen and to talk. So Paul began to address them, and he says, "I understand that you are very religious folk." That's really the better translation of it. He said, "Well, I've seen idols, statues all over this whole city. In fact, on the way up here, I passed one that was dedicated to the unknown God. So clearly, you've made statues to every god you know of, or you think you know of, and in case you left one out, you've made one extra. You've dedicated that to the unknown God. That's the one that I'm going to tell you about today. I want to declare the unknown God to you. I'm going to tell you about the God you don't know. The God that made the world and all things therein. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. He dwells not in temples made with hands. He's not worshipped with men's hands as though He needs anything. He's not in need of anything you have to give. Rather, He gives to all life and breath and all things. He's made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth. He has determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. Do you realize that history is written in advance? The great rise and fall of empires, the ebb and flow of events, the rise of great powers, the departure from the scene of others who have played a significant role. God has determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. So, it's not an accident that certain nations rose to power at certain times. It's not an accident that the English-speaking nations rose to power beginning in the early 1800s and achieved possession of major strategic areas all over the earth. It's not an accident that certain other nations down through history, going back to Egypt and Babylon, going back to the Greeks of Alexander, going back to the Romans, going back to all of the rise and fall of powers, whether it's the Islamic powers and from Arabia or any of the others. It's not an accident that different ones rose to power when they did and eventually their empires faded. The migration of peoples into certain areas of the world. God has determined the times before appointed, the bounds of their habitation. Paul goes on to talk about the fact in verse 31 that God has appointed a day. He has appointed a day in which He will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom He has ordained, whereof He has given assurance unto all men, and that He raised Him from the dead. God has appointed a day. God has appointed someone to carry out that judgment. God has raised that individual from the dead. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, well, we'll hear a little more about this later. Paul departed from among them. Howbeit certain men clave unto him and believed, among the which was Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with him. You know, in a little village of Berea, we're told many believed, and not a few of the Greek women and men. Here, we're told 2 people by name, and a few others, probably members of their household, maybe a couple of friends, but basically there were 2 people. You ever thought about what the difference was? The difference, of course, to a great extent was attitude. The people in Berea listened intently, and then they searched the Scriptures to see whether it was so. They checked it out, proved it out, and believed what the Bible said, and they acted on it. The people in Athens were filled up with a lot of intellectual pride and vanity. They loved to hear and tell some new thing. That was what they enjoyed doing. I think that's one of the problems that we've had in the church in recent days. We've had what I would call a Mars Hill mentality that has gripped a lot of people. They love to talk about religion. They just don't like to prove it out and change their lives. Well, they like to discuss it, like to hear some new thing. Oh, you got a new theory on that. Oh, well, that's interesting, Never heard that before. And so, well, this guy says this, and this one says that, and the other one says something else. And boy, this fellow over here, he really got some different ideas. You ought to listen to him. Mars Hill. Mars Hill. Mars Hill never produced a whole lot of spiritual fruit. There were a couple of people. By and large, Athens was not a productive place, spiritually. Because Athens was filled with a spirit of intellectual pride. People who loved to discuss and to argue, to hear and tell. But they didn't have a humble attitude of searching the Scriptures, proving what God said, and changing their lives based on what God said. It's interesting what Paul addressed, the approach that he took with these people. He talked about, number one, the unknown God, the Creator. And he said that Creator is going to judge His creation. He has determined the times before appointed, the bounds of habitation. The Greeks had had their day in the sun under Alexander the Great. Now the Greeks were a part of the Roman Empire. And the Greeks, of course, their pride rested on the fact that they thought they were smarter than everyone else. The Romans' pride rested on the fact that they thought they were more powerful than anyone else, so therefore they were the best. Everybody had something they were proud of. Jews were proud of what they knew about God. You know, when you go through the book of Romans, Paul sort of ripped into everybody's pride. Made the point that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Jew, Gentile, with the law, without the law, doesn't matter. Everybody has fallen short. And God is going to judge the world, and we're here celebrating a day that is a memorial of the blowing of trumpets. A day that represents the time when the great God will step into history. A time that represents the ushering in of the final phase in God's plan. The final phase of salvation. You know, maybe we haven't thought of it in quite this way, but most of the Bible really follows through on the story of two men and two cities. The origins were intertwined, and the conclusions are intertwined. One is destined to be destroyed forever, and the other is destined to be created anew, to endure forever. This current world, this present evil world, as Peter uses the term, has its origins beginning in the events recorded in Genesis 10. After God's judgment upon the world in the days of Noah, He sent a flood and destroyed humanity. After the flood, the family of man began to increase rapidly. Genesis 10 and verse 1 says, "Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and unto them were sons born after the flood." And it begins to enumerate first the sons of Japheth, then in verse 6, the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. And in verse 7, the sons of Cush, Sheba, and Havilah, and Sabta, and Ramah, and Sabteka, the sons of Ramah. And then we're told in verse 8, "And Cush begat Nimrod. He, Nimrod, began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel." That was the starting point. That was the city that Nimrod built. And you read of that city and the building of it in Genesis 11. Now Nimrod, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Then he went on to Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And out of that land, he went into Assyria, that's the better translation of it, and built Nineveh and the city Rehoboth and Calah. Now, the beginning of his kingdom. Nimrod, whose name derives from the Hebrew word marad, which means he rebelled. Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord, or in the place of God. Nimrod, the mighty hunter. You know, as the human population began to increase rapidly in the aftermath of the flood, of course, everything had been wiped out. And animals reproduced very quickly, and of course, they spread very quickly, and there were not the... as the population, the land was there, everything was springing up, and very quickly the wild animals began to grow and to have great increase in population. And Nimrod was the mighty hunter. He presented himself as the protector and the defender. Then we're told in Genesis 11, verse 1, that the whole earth was of one language and one speech. After all, we're only about 100 years after the flood. And as it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, from the area of Ararat, where the ark had originally rested, the area of Armenia, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. That is, that area between the two rivers, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. We call it Mesopotamia, which is simply a Greek word that means between the two rivers. And they said unto one another, Go to, let us make brick, burn them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar, and they said, Let's build a city and a tower. We're going to make a name. Now, God came down and beheld the city and the tower, and God saw that they did not want to follow His instructions, which were to spread out and to repopulate the earth. And so He confounded their languages and forced them to leave off the building of the city. The name of the city, verse 9, is called Babel. God confused the languages, and from thence He scattered them abroad upon the face of all the earth. As human beings spread out from Babel, they took with them the religion and the culture of Babel. And that's why when you look around the world at various pagan ideas, that there is a similarity. There are similar holidays and similar concepts that sprang from Babel. The city that Nimrod built. The beginning of Nimrod's kingdom was Babel. It was a symbol of rebellion against God. It was an attempt to have one world the devil's way. One world. Now, we are rapidly moving today toward the concept of one world, linked together economically. But in order to be linked and to remain linked economically, there have to be military and political links, and the missing ingredient, the ingredient that is not yet there, is the glue to hold it all together, which is the religious link. You don't whip people up to an emotional fervor to maintain corporate profits. You know, people all over the earth don't get all excited about seeing some big multinational conglomerate getting bigger. And yet, as a result of this system, the merchants of the earth will wax rich. That's what we're told in Revelation 18. No, Babylon the Great involves religion as well as economics, military, and political aspects. All four are together. They were all present initially in Babel, the city that Nimrod built. God intervened, confounded the people's language, and caused them to spread out. Different groups of mankind went into different areas. God didn't give a different language to every single person. He gave it to certain family groupings. And so the various ethnic groups spread out and populated different areas of the world, no longer able to stay there and to talk and to understand one another. So they settled the areas because God had determined before the bounds of their habitation. He already had in mind where He wanted different people, different branches of the human family to settle. But the city that Nimrod built, while the building of the city and the tower was temporarily stopped, that city has continued on down. When we come to the book of Daniel, we read about a king who had come to power in Babylon, a man by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, who conquered Jerusalem. And he carried into captivity many young Jewish boys of noble families as well as others. There were 3 periods of captivity. After the initial invasion of Jerusalem around 604, and then another second invasion around 595, and then the final invasion around 586, where the third invasion is when the temple was destroyed. But Daniel was taken into captivity in the first invasion. And Daniel and others were taken to this city of Babylon. And Daniel had the opportunity to see the shaping up of this system. And God gave Daniel visions, gave him several visions, and initially had given a vision to the king of Babylon, to Nebuchadnezzar himself. That vision is recorded in Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar had had a dream, and in his dream he had seen a great image that was mammoth in size. And it had a head of gold and shoulders of silver and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and the feet were of iron and miry clay, a mixture of iron and ceramic clay. Then, in his vision, he saw a great stone, a stone of supernatural origin, cut out without hands. And the stone descended from heaven and smashed the image on its toes. The whole image turned to dust and blew away. And the stone became a great mountain and filled the earth. Nebuchadnezzar was very puzzled. And he summoned his magicians and his astrologers, and he said, I have had a dream, and I want you to tell me what I dreamed and what it meant. Well, they said, well, King, you tell us what you dreamed, and we'll explain to you what it means. And he said, oh, no, you don't. If you can't tell me what I dreamed, then why should I believe that you are inspired to tell me what it means? I'll believe your interpretation if you can tell me what I dreamed to begin with. Oh, well, they said, we can't do that. Nobody can do that. So Nebuchadnezzar, being a fellow who had a little bit of a fiery temper, gave orders that they be hacked into little pieces and their houses be made dunghills. So he sort of got mad, and he was ready to chop people up into little big pieces. That's what it says here. Word reached Daniel, and he really had no desire to be chopped up into little bitty pieces. And he and his friends sought God and went, they prayed to God and asked for an interview with the king. And Daniel came in before the king, and he said, King, I serve the God of heaven. And He is a revealer of secrets. And the God whom I serve will inspire me to tell you what you dreamed and what it meant. And God gave Daniel that understanding, and Daniel was able to recount to the king his dream. And the king just sat there, you can imagine, just in amazement as Daniel went through and recounted the details. And he says, this is what you dreamed. And the king said, yeah, that's right. And Daniel said, now let me explain to you what it meant. Well, the king at this point was certainly willing to listen because he knew that clearly Daniel had access to information that was not just on a human level. And Daniel said, you, O king, represent the head of gold. That represents you. And he says, after you, there's going to arise another kingdom, a second kingdom. That's symbolized by the shoulders of silver. And after that, there will arise yet a third kingdom, symbolized by the thighs of brass. And finally, there will arise the fourth kingdom upon the earth, symbolized by the legs of iron. And then these toes. In the days of those kings, those final 10 kings, symbolized by the 10 toes, you see, the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that shall never be removed. That's what we're told in verse 44. That kingdom is going to be set up, the stone cut out without hands. It's going to smash the image. Now, we know from history that what Daniel said came to pass. In fact, during Daniel's lifetime, he saw the first transition. The transition from the head of gold to the shoulders and chest of silver. That's recorded in the book of Daniel. You remember the story. It's one of the famous stories of the Bible. Belshazzar, you remember, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, who was having this big drunken party for all of his rulers, all of the men who ruled under him. They were having this big celebration. Interestingly enough, we know from history that the celebration was on the evening that began the Feast of Trumpets. It was the evening that began the first day of the 7th month. And on that evening of the Feast of Trumpets, as they were drinking and partying, you see, Babylon was under siege and had been for several months. Cyrus of Persia had an army encamped outside, but the Babylonians were proud. And they knew in their own mind, as far as they were concerned, their city was impregnable. The walls of Babylon were mammoth. They were so wide and so great that you could literally have chariot races around the top. It was of mammoth size and magnitude, the walls of Babylon. You couldn't break them down. Babylon had a tributary of the Euphrates River that actually flowed underneath it. And there were great... this provided them water, which meant that they weren't going to run out of water in a siege. The great iron gates and the great mammoth city, why, they knew no one could conquer Babylon. And so Belshazzar was really feeling proud of himself. And after they had been drinking for a while, Belshazzar gave orders that the vessels from the temple in Jerusalem, which his grandfather had taken and brought to Babylon many years earlier, that those sacred vessels were to be brought into the banquet room, and that they would fill them with wine and drink to the gods of gold and silver, brass, stone, and wood. Quite an audacious request And as they laughed and talked and boasted, and as they sung their praises to the gods of gold and silver, and as they lifted high the vessels from the temple and made toasts to the god of Babylon, the gods of Babylon, all of a sudden, the party was over. Appearing mysteriously out of nowhere, this embodied hand began to write in fiery letters upon the wall words in the Babylonian language, but words that in the context seem meaningless to the people who read them. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. That's the way it's transliterated into English. The mina, the shekel, the perez were weights and measures. It's sort of like if you and I were to see something like that and written on the wall would be the phrase pounds, pounds, tons, and ounces. You know what the words mean. I mean, you recognize the word, but it's meaningless in the context. You have no clue what's all of that about. Obviously, something pretty significant, because when a hand appears out of nowhere and begins to write on the wall, that would get your attention, wouldn't it? I would suspect about that time the drinking stopped. In fact, we're told the king of Babylon was so scared that he had a rather embarrassing accident. We're told that his knees smote one upon another and the joints of his loins were loosed. I will leave to your imagination what that means. You can check it up in a commentary if you want to find out. It scared him to death. You know, imagine. Here's somebody all filled with pride and all boasting and just filled up with all of this stuff, and they've been boozing it up and drinking through the evening. The hand writes on the wall. They were frightened. They didn't know what it meant. Finally, the king's mother suggested, said, why don't you call in a man who in the days of your ancestor Nebuchadnezzar was a man of great prominence. He was a man who had special understanding and insight. And surely he can tell you what it means. Daniel came in and he gave the interpretation. He read the words. And he says, you are weighed in the balances and found wanting. This very night your kingdom shall be divided to the Medes and the Persians. You're going to be killed, king. Your empire, your kingdom is going to cease. It's going to be swallowed up by others. That very night, you see, unknown to Belshazzar, Cyrus's troops had been performing a great engineering feat. They had, a ways away, dug a diversionary channel. And that evening, after dark, Belshazzar was boozing it up with his buddies there in the banquet room. The levee was broken. And that tributary of the Euphrates began very quickly to divert off into the other channel and to go into another portion of the Euphrates. And the channel that flowed underneath the walls of Babylon began to drop very rapidly in terms of its height. And within a matter of hours, the water was shallow enough that some of Cyrus's troops actually walked in the muddy river bottom underneath the wall, emerged on the other side, unlocked the big gates, and all the army came through, and Babylon fell in one evening. In one night. Babylon was fallen. Daniel lived to see that. He saw that head of gold succeeded by the shoulders and chest of silver. He saw that second kingdom, the empire of the Medes and the Persians, arise. He records prophetically the events that history tells us about, that about 200 years after that event, Alexander the Great arose in Europe and Greece, crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with his troops, and within a short matter of time defeated the Persian armies and established the Greco-Macedonian Empire that covered the entire Middle Eastern area, from all the way from Greece all the way down across into what is now modern-day India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, down to Ethiopia. It included a vast area. Alexander's empire. Various of his generals continued it after his death, but it was the same empire in terms of language, culture, religion, philosophy. In the aftermath of Alexander's empire arose a final empire, the fourth of the ones that Daniel described, symbolized by the legs of iron. The Roman Empire, again a matter of history, swallowed up the components of the old Greco-Macedonian Empire. And the Empire of Rome was set up, fully established by 31 BC with the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony there in Egypt. And the Roman Empire had finally then swallowed up all of the remains of Alexander's empire. The Roman Empire is pictured as continuing on down through history, symbolized by two legs. Now, interestingly, the Roman Empire was divided into the Eastern and Western Roman Empire. It continued down historically in those two phases. The Western Roman Empire gave shape and definition to Western Europe, to Latin, Catholic, Germanic Europe. The Eastern Empire, in the same way, gave shape and definition to Eastern Europe. Greek, Slavic, Orthodox Europe. Those two successors of Babylon, or in reality of Babylon, of Persia, of Greece, of Rome, those two legs of the Roman Empire continue all the way down. And finally, we're told in the final days, Daniel saw 2 feet. And he focused in on the toes and the feet composed of a mixture of iron and ceramic clay. A mixture that is not well mixed. Something that a blow will shatter and will cause to separate. That is a very temporary situation that will arise. That attempt to put back together again the successors of both Eastern and Western Rome, of Rome and Byzantium, the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire. It is in the days of those final kings that the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be removed. You know, Isaiah talks about these things, referring to that system as the daughter of Babylon. Revelation uses the term Babylon the Great. It's not the same city that Nimrod built, but it is the successor to the city that Nimrod built. It is the continuation of that system, the Babylonian mystery religion that began with Nimrod. That system that continues all the way down, that will emerge once more as the daughter of Babylon, Babylon the Great, that great city that will rule over and dominate the entire world. Revelation chapter 17 describes the religious, military, and political components. Revelation 18 describes the commercial and economic. John, in Revelation 17, saw a great woman, called here in Revelation 17:1 the great whore, a great prostitute that dominates many nations and tongues and languages and peoples. And this woman was pictured as sitting on a terrible-looking creature. She has a name, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And what John sees finally emerges in Revelation 17:12. He sees 10 kings, symbolized by 10 horns. They are the ones who make war with the Lamb. So this is the final rulers of that system. They will be overcome by Jesus Christ. Revelation 17:14, these will make war with the Lamb shall overcome them, for He's Lord of lords and King of kings. And they that are with Him are called and chosen and faithful. You remember, brethren, we're told to make our calling and election sure. How do you make your calling and election sure? By remaining faithful. Those that are with Christ are called. There are many who have been called, but few who have been chosen. There are many who have heard the call. You know, a lot of people say, well, you know, I wonder if God's calling. Well, I think the more appropriate question is, I need to wonder whether I'm answering. You know, if I know enough to wonder, I wonder if He's calling. That's sort of like a kid, you know, you're over here playing and you hear Mama calling, you know, and I wonder if she means for me to come home. Well, why do you think she's out on the porch? The question isn't, you know, for those of us here, the question isn't, are you being called? The question is, are you answering the call? How are you responding? Are you hoping, you know, maybe you'll call back? Maybe you'll hang up and call back later. Sort of not real convenient right now. I'm absorbed in something I really am enjoying doing. You know, I don't want to quit and have to come, so maybe he'll call back later. Well, those that are with Him are called and chosen. Chosen. And faithful. God He must call and choose, but we must remain faithful. That's why Jesus said, He that endures to the end, the same shall be saved. To endure is to abide. How do you abide in Christ? You abide in Christ when His Word abides in you. That's what Jesus said in John 1. And John, you can go through and make a study of it. To be faithful is to be faithful to your calling. It's to be faithful to the truth. It is to abide in Christ, remaining faithful. Those that are with Him. You see, that's what we're anticipating. And we see here, as this system begins to turn upon itself, chapter 18 continues right on. He says, I'm going to show you the judgment on Babylon. All nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, Revelation 18:3. Babylon the Great is fallen. I heard another voice, verse 4 of Revelation 18, saying, Come out of her, my people, that you be not partakers of her sin, that you receive not of her plagues. Her sins have reached unto heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. The judgment plagues of this day are judgments on Babylon. Babylon the Great is fallen. The city that Nimrod built will not endure. Oh, it describes the merchants of the earth being made rich as a result of this system, Revelation 18:15. And yet we're told in verse 17, in 1 hour so great riches has come to naught. It's going to go up in a mushroom-shaped cloud. And so Babylon the Great is fallen. Is fallen. It will become the hold of every foul spirit, the habitation of demons. That's where they're going to be kept during the period of the millennium. That's where the great abyss is going to be. Nimrod City, the successor of Nimrod City, the daughter of Babylon, will not endure. Nimrod and his system will pass from the scene. But right there in the next chapter that we had read in the book of Genesis, you know, in Genesis 10 and 11, we read about Nimrod and Babel. In the end of Genesis 11, we're introduced to a man that is the most prominent figure in terms of a human being through the rest of the Bible. His name was Abram. Abram grew up in the very shadow of the Tower of Babel. He grew up in Ur of the Chaldees, not Ur up in northern Mesopotamia, as some commentaries say, but the Bible says Ur of the Chaldees, the land of the Chaldeans, was in the area of Shinar. The Chaldeans were the Babylonians. Abraham and his family left Ur of the Chaldees, went up into northern Mesopotamia to the area of Haran, and then from there he went on to the Promised Land. That's described in Genesis 12. God called a man out of Babylon. And He called him to come to a land that he would afterward inherit. And all of the promises were made to Abraham, and you and I inherit as the heir of Abraham, because Abraham was the father of the faithful. And God promised to Abraham the world. You and I inherit as his heirs. Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees. He left the area of Babylon. And Abraham, at the age of 75, left Haran. And for the final 100 years of his life, he dwelt in a tent. He dwelt in a tabernacle, a temporary dwelling. But we're told in Hebrews 11 that Abraham lived as a stranger, a pilgrim, a temporary sojourner, but he was looking for something. Hebrews 11 tells us that Abraham looked for a city that has foundations, whose maker and builder is God. Abraham lived in a tent. A tent doesn't have foundations. He just pitched a tent. I don't know about you. I camped for years in Big Sandy at Feast. A number of you did. I enjoyed it. But I'll tell you what, after about 8 days, I was sure ready to fold up my tent and go back and sleep in a real bed again. I always look forward to the feast coming, but I was always sort of glad to fold up my tent. I don't think that the idea of living in a tent for 16 days or 16 weeks or 16 months or 16 years would have really been a real appealing thought. Abraham lived in a tent for 100 years. He left Haran when he was 75 after his father died, and Abraham lived to be 175. That's 100 years. And we're told that all that time he received not the promises. God promised him something, but Abraham lived in anticipation, and he died not having yet received the promises. That's what we're told in Hebrews 11. Abraham lived his life by faith. He saw something. Now, the irony? These two cities, because the city that Abraham looked for is the city that has foundations, whose maker and builder is God, well, that's the city that you and I read of in the very end of Revelation. In Revelation 18, you find that Babylon the Great has fallen. It's gone forever. And you get to Revelation 21. You read about a city coming down out of heaven from God, whose maker and builder is God, coming down to the earth. And that city doesn't just have one foundation. It's got a whole bunch of foundations. It's got 12 foundations. Abraham looked for that city, and Abraham died in faith, not having yet received it. But Abraham is going to inhabit that city. Now, these two men and their cities, Nimrod and Babylon, Abraham and the New Jerusalem, represent two entirely different ways of life and approaches to life. One is based on reality, and the other is based on an illusion. And yet the paradox is, the illusion is based on what people think they can see, and the reality is based on what you can't see. Now that sounds backward. But you could see the city that Nimrod built. It was built out of brick and mortar. It was an impressive place. You could see it. You could touch it. It seemed real. And yet, the literal city has long since been buried by the sands, and the system and what it symbolizes, and the final daughter of Babylon is going to be destroyed forever and become simply the habitation of demons. What you can see, what seems so real, and in the years ahead, incredible pressure is going to be brought to bear on people to give their loyalty, their allegiance, their devotion to that system, to go along with it. Because based on everything you can see, you won't be able to live and function if you don't give your devotion and loyalty to it. If you don't accept the outward trappings of that system. How are you going to hold a job? How are you going to function? How are you going to do this? How are you going to do that? You see, if you base your life on what you can see, you're going to be part of something that's going to go up in smoke. It'll be no more. Abraham, on the other hand, based his life on what he couldn't see. God made a promise, and Abraham believed God. He believed God. Now, that's a very simple thing. And yet Abraham believed God, and the rest of his life was based on following where God led. And God led him down and said, Abraham, I got a place I want to get you. Abraham got there and he found out, he got sort of a rude awakening. He got there. Number one, he found out other people were already there. Now, you know, that can be a little bit disconcerting. Somebody said, you know, I've got a beautiful house I want to give you. Here, let me show you where it is. So you go up there, and you get there, and you think, my, that's, you know, that looks nice. But then you see that there are other people already living there. You know, it's occupied. Cars in the driveway, curtains in the window, you know, flower pots on the windowsill. Well, that's a great place, and I know that you're going to give it to me. I mean, you said you're going to give it to me. Who's going to break the news to them? I hope you are, because I don't think they're going to take it coming from me. Abraham got there and he found out the place was already inhabited, and then the next thing he found out was he got there and famine struck the land, and so he wound up having to go all the way down to Egypt to just keep his herds and flocks alive. Now, you know, that could be a little bit disappointing. Not to mention the fact that he was 75 when all this started, and God said, I'm going to make of you a great nation. Of course, he didn't have any kids, and he must have thought, well, you're going to have to do it pretty quick. And God didn't do it pretty quick. In fact, he let a few years go by. And more years went by, and more years went by. And finally, when he was 99, God appeared to him and said, Abraham, I'm changing your name. You've just been known as Abram. Now, I want you to go out of the tent. I want you to call all your people together, all your servants, and I want you to announce to them that from now on you are to be known as Father of a Multitude. Now, he's 99. He doesn't have any kids. And he says, you know, from now on, I want you to call me Father of a Multitude, because we're about to get this thing started. You know, that had to take faith, don't you think? People must have thought he's the most optimistic fellow I've ever met. But you know, a year later, he had a son. Now, that's off to a running start. He's waited 99 years and he has one child. I'm going to make you father of a multitude. And that one child waited for years, finally got married, and he had 2 children. Well, boy, we're really moving forward now. Well, God says one of those doesn't count. We'll take the younger of the twins, and we'll make him the great nation. So now we're on the 3rd generation, and we got one. Well, God gave him 12 sons, and then it began to multiply very rapidly. The point is, God knew where he was going. God was right on schedule. The times were before appointed. The bounds of their habitation were set. God had things planned out. But if you lived life based on what you saw, you'd never come to that conclusion. You would have never thought. In fact, if you're going to look at it on a human level, you'd have to say, you'd look at Abraham and said, well, you know, you poor fellow, you really, I don't see how this can happen. This can't work. This won't happen. You would have thought, just on a human carnal level, Abraham was the one basing his life on an illusion. But you see, it was the reverse. Abraham based his life on the promises of God. And there's nothing more real than the reality of God and His Word and His promises. Abraham died in faith, not having yet received the promises, but he saw them afar off. He was persuaded of them. He confessed that he was a stranger and a pilgrim. He looked for a city that has foundations, whose maker and builder is God. The time is going to come. We're here celebrating a memorial of the blowing of trumpets, when Jesus Christ is going to return to this earth. And He's going to usher in that final phase. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and King David, and the Apostle Paul, and Peter, and James, and John, and any number of others, men and women that you and I have never even heard of, as well as some of the great heroes of the Bible, are going to rise in the air. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. Some, including even friends and family that you and I have had, who have died in the faith and are buried. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the sound of that last trumpet, they're going to begin to emerge from the ground. The dust will no longer hold. The grave will no longer be their prison. They're going to come forth not as a weak human being, but in power and glory. Their face shining. That body that was sick, weak, that finally died, that had decayed and returned to the elements from which it was made, that body is going to come forth in a great and glorious body. Those of us that are alive and remain won't precede them, but immediately afterward, we ourselves will also undergo a change. And this mortal will put on immortality. You and I can't even fully grasp what it would be to have your body undergo that transformation. No longer sick and tired. No longer all of the things that afflict us in the flesh. But in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, changed. That which is born of the flesh is flesh. You and I are flesh. But that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. And you and I will step into eternity in a moment and in the twinkling of an eye. Jesus Christ is going to set up a literal government on this earth. You and I are going to have a position and a place in that government, a place in that kingdom, as are the men and women of whom we read in Scripture. We're going to live and reign throughout this 1,000-year period. Then God's going to deal with the rest of humanity, those who've never had an opportunity. And then the incorrigibly wicked, those who have had their opportunity and have sinned willfully, have turned aside knowingly, are going to be brought up to face their final judgment and punishment and to perish in the lake of fire. That fire that will sweep over and purge the face of the whole earth. Because a new heavens and a new earth will emerge in the aftermath of that fiery conflagration that will consume this earth. A new heavens and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. And the heavenly city, New Jerusalem, will come down from God out of heaven, and Abraham, who lived his life in anticipation, will see that city whose maker and builder is God. That city that you and I are destined to inherit. That city that you and I are destined to inhabit. That city is going to come. It's going to be established. The Bible closes at that point, leaving us standing on the very brink of eternity. Nimrod and Babylon will be no more. Abraham and the New Jerusalem will be forever. You see, the way of life based on faith is based on what is real. That which is based on sight is based on an illusion. It's based on what is temporary. We're told in Romans chapter 8, in verse 16, that the Spirit itself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God, and if children, then heirs. Heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. If so be that we suffer with Him, that we may be also glorified together. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. I don't care what you and I may be faced with, what we may have to go through right now, or what we may have to go through in the years ahead. There is nothing whatsoever that is worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. God is bringing many sons unto glory. We're heirs. Heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. Glorified together with Him. The Apostle Paul talks about in Hebrews chapter 10. Talks about in Hebrews chapter 10, in verse 23, he says, "Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering. For He is faithful that promised. Let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching." You see, we're told in verse 32, "Call to remembrance the former days, in which after you were illuminated, after you understood and saw the truth, you endured a great fight of afflictions." You went through a lot of things. He says in verse 35, "Don't cast away your confidence, which has great recompense of reward, for you have need of patience, that after you've done the will of God, you might receive the promise.
For yet a little while, and he that shall come, and will not tarry. The just shall live by faith. If any man draw back, my soul shall have no pleasure in it. He that shall come, and will not tarry. Do you and I, can we really fully grasp that? That the time is literally going to come when the trumpet blast will split the air. And when finally the culmination of God's plan of salvation begins. When he that shall come will come. He really, really will. He that shall come will come and will not tarry. Brethren, we're here celebrating a memorial of the blowing of trumpets. A memorial of all of the trumpets, and in particular, that final and seventh trumpet, which will signal the coming of him who shall come. He really, really